Hello and welcome to the Gothic Colour channel. This video is to introduce my 20's design with information on how you can use it to make a shirred summer top using 1 meter of cotton fabric. As usual with my videos, I am going to start by talking about my design and then move on to the sewing. In the description box below, I have links to the different sections of the video so you can easily skip ahead to the section you are most interested in. So if you are only interested in the construction of the top, then go ahead and skip to that part. The 20's design that is used in this video is one of 3 designs inspired by Art Nouveau and Art Deco. The other 2 designs are called the Noughts and the 10's, referring to the early decades of the 1900s. Each of these 3 designs comes in a number of color variations. The top and dress I made in my last 2 videos are examples of some of the things you can make with these designs. However, the top I will be showing you today works best with the 20's design, so this is the design I will be showcasing in this video. Links to the respective designs and color variations can be found in the description box of each video. The 20's design is specifically inspired by geometric Art Deco decorative patterns. So let me start by showing you the samplers that I received from my 2 shops. On the left are those from fashionformula.com and on the right from spoonflower.com. Starting with the light colors, we have a subtle ivory marble effect design on light green. As you can see, the Fashion Formula version is much lighter and yellower green than the Spoonflower sampler. Then we have the design on a light aqua blue. The Spoonflower sampler is a bit more saturated and greener in hue than the Fashion Formula one, which is a more clear cyan hue. Next we have the lilac pink version. The pink on the sampler from Spoonflower is warmer than that on the Fashion Formula one. Next we have the design on peach pink. Here the sampler from Spoonflower is a little pinkier and more saturated than the Fashion Formula one, which is a more of a pastel orange color. Moving on to a different take on the design and the background colors, here the design has a monochrome clear form in grey and white, which is set against dusky colors. First, you can see the design on dusky green. The Fashion Formula sampler is a bit brighter in color, while the Spoonflower one is more grey in tone. This is also the case with the rest of the dusky colors. Here, the design on dusky blue, the design on dusky purple, and on dusky pink. Next we have the design on dark colors. Here the design has an antique gold foil effect with a black drop shadow. Just to be clear, by gold effect I refer to the color shading. These fabrics do not have any metallic colors on them. Firstly, we have the design on dark green. The green on the Fashion Formula sampler is richer and warmer than on the Spoonflower one, but they are very close. Next we have the design on blue. The Fashion Formula version is a true blue. The colors on the Spoonflower version have a red undertone to them. Then we move on to the dark red. Here the difference doesn't show very well on screen, but the Fashion Formula sampler is a little bit richer and warmer than the Spoonflower one. Finally, we have the design on dark grey. The colors on the Fashion Formula version are a bit more neutral, while the Spoonflower version has a red undertone to it again. Do note, however, that the fabric printed can also affect the appearance of the colors, so it is always a good idea to get a sampler on your preferred fabric before committing to buying a whole meter. So let's talk about materials and measurements. For this top I used 1 meter of the 20's design on red. The fabric I used is 100% cotton slub, that is 140 centimeters, roughly 55 inches wide, for the top to fit on measurements of 92 centimeters or about 36 inches chest, 82 centimeters or about 32 inches waist, and 104 centimeters or about 41 inches hips. To make this top using the 20's fabric, you will need to cut off the central design. The upper and lower parts of the design will be joined to form the top, while the central panel will make the straps. A lot of the shaping will be achieved with the shirring itself, but you will want to shape the top a little bit to help with this. In particular, if you have a pronounced curve at the back, it will help removing some of the fabric so you don't end up with an excess in this area, since this can form unflattering bumps even after shirring. So it is best to sew up the upper and lower parts of the fabric separately at an angle and join them in the middle at a slight angle again. How much of an angle will depend on the curvature of the body and the tightness of the shirring. It doesn't need to be super precise, as the shirring will help smooth things out. What I did with the project shown in this video was aim roughly for an extra 50% of fabric around the over bust area, the waist and the upper hips. Regarding other materials, I used red thread and shirring elastic. I ended up using about 40 meters of the shirring elastic for this project. The needles that I used on my sewing machine for this fabric were universal needles size 90. So moving on to the construction of the top. As always, I started by washing and pressing the fabric to make sure it shrunk to its final size. My plan with the slub fabric was to use its casual texture so that the final top has a bit of a crinkled effect, so it doesn't need ironing. However, during the construction of the top, I wanted the fabric to be pressed so that the seams would be sewn properly and evenly on the fabric, regardless of how the fabric ended up positioning itself after washing. Then I cut the fabric. I cut out the middle section of the design so I could use it for the straps as mentioned earlier. The central part of the top will be shirred, so if I left the design there, it would have been distorted anyway. Taking the lower part of the cut fabric, I folded it in half and made sure the design on both sides sat parallel to each other so they matched. I then marked a diagonal sewing line to make the part closest to the waist narrower than the part close to the hips. I did the same thing with the upper part of the cut fabric, with the area around the bust wider than that around the waist. I then sewed them closed, cut the seam allowances and overlocked them to stop them from fraying. I then concentrated on the top section of the fabric. I marked the fabric at an even distance from the design and folded it to hem the top. I then experimented on scraps of my fabric to find the best tension and length for shirring on my sewing machine. I also experimented with a waffle shirring that I wanted to use on this top to find out the distance I wanted between my stitching. I then marked the grid for my shirring on the red band that would go around over the bust and under the armpits. I started by shirring the vertical lines, as you can see here. And then moved on to the horizontal lines. Once I finished that, I moved on to the lower section. Since the lower part, which forms a peplum, will not have any shirring, I measured the red band at the top after shirring and marked the hem to be at roughly the same distance from the design so that they are balanced. I then sewed up the lower hem using 2 parallel stitches, as you can see here. Next, I matched and basted the upper and lower sections of the fabric at the waist and sewed it up, as you can see here. Once that was done, I cut off any excess from the seam allowances and overlocked the edges since the fabric was prone to fraying. Then came the very time-consuming process of marking out the grid for the shirring. You can, of course, just follow the edge of your sewing machine foot to keep your shirring even, but I was shirring my fabric at a slightly wider distance, and I wanted the result to look neat, so despite the tediousness it was worth taking the time on this. Also, as the fabric was shaped during cutting and sewing, I marked my lines at a slightly bigger distance at the under bust and upper hip areas, while the lines at the waist I marked closer together to enhance the shaping of the top. Also, as I was going to be shirring over seam allowances, I pinned these flat against the outer fabric to avoid any accidental gathering that would result in ugly bumps on the top. Do bear in mind though that the sections with the seam allowances will look a little bit bulkier than the rest because of the double layer of fabric. So here I'm tackling the shirring in the middle section of the top. I started again by shirring the vertical lines first. This was because there are more vertical lines and they are shorter, so it is a bit easier to tackle these before the fabric is all crinkled up. Starting at the back, this helps secure the seam allowances on the back stitch. This is a lot to shirr and it takes a while, so make sure you have plenty of free time to sew when you start this. Here you can see me finishing with the vertical lines and starting on the horizontal ones. Now, in an ideal world, you would be able to do all your shirring using one continuous piece of shirring elastic, but bobbins don't hold enough to get through all this shirring, so whatever happens you will need to stop on occasion, tie up your threads and reload your bobbin. Let me show you how to deal with the bobbin of a top loading machine. Take the end of your shirring elastic and if it is a bit frayed, cut off a bit. Then pass the end through the hole on your bobbin as you would do with a normal thread. Put your bobbin onto your bobbin winder spindle and click it into position, again as you would do with a normal thread. Now, unlike a normal thread, do not put your elastic through the thread guide that creates tension. Instead, let your spool loose on the floor and use one hand to hold onto the end of your thread so it doesn't come off your bobbin, and the other hand to guide the elastic. Do not pinch the elastic but let it glide through your fingers whilst guiding it up and down so that it is evenly distributed onto the bobbin. Best do this at the lowest winding speed you can do. I'm sorry you cannot see this very clearly since my hand is in the way. In the description box below I have linked a useful tutorial I found on YouTube about the basics of shirring. Once the bobbin is full, it will stop as it does for a regular thread. After taking the bobbin off the spindle, I cut the untidy end of the elastic off the top and also cut the rest off the spool, leaving a reasonable amount of extra elastic to help with the loading. Load the bobbin as you would with regular thread, though because of the thickness of the elastic you may need to pull it quite firmly to make sure it goes properly between the tension spring blades. It's easier to draw the elastic up before closing the bobbin cover plate, as you can see here. Once you have drawn up the elastic, just as you would with a regular thread, you can close the cover. Here you can see the knot I made at the end of the elastic before starting a freshly wound bobbin to continue with the shirring. It is best to start the shirring a few stitches before the end of your previous elastic. Right, so after finishing with the shirring, it's time to tackle the straps. I started off by overlocking the edges to stop the fabric from fraying and then hemmed them to neaten things up. I wanted the straps to create an X at the back, so the best way to find out where to cut them was to do a fitting and pin them onto the top. Once I cut the ends, I overlocked them and stitched them up to create a secure end. I then hand-stitched the straps onto the top. It is way easier and neater to hand-stitch these into position than using the sewing machine. And finally, after washing and drying, here is the completed top. I have to say that even though I thought the seam allowance in the middle seam would be a bit bulky, I didn't realize it would create such an obvious disturbance in the shirring. It doesn't bother me too much, but if you were to make this top or something similar, I would suggest you cut as much of the seam allowance off as your fabric allows and stitch the edges with a long and relatively narrow zigzag stitch to help against any fraying. There are a few things I'm considering for my next couple of videos. One is for a very simple gathered skirt using a textural pattern, and one is for a more complex piece of clothing such as the shirt using one of my animal head prints. In the meantime, do subscribe and click on notifications so you get notified of my next upload. Goodbye!